So in addition to our guest speaker today, we also have a very special guest who wanted to bring greetings here before, unfortunately, she has to leave to make another commitment. So President Claire Stirk would like to offer a few words of greeting, and with that, please join me in welcoming her.
Well, thank you. I know I stand between you and a very important and incredible speaker, so I'll try to keep this short. And thank you so much, Dr. Gillespie, for allowing me the opportunity to welcome all of you, because this is really important to Emory, to all of us, and to me as a person as well. And what I'd like to do, because Andra doesn't do it well enough, because she's humble, is tell you a little bit about the James Weldon Johnson Institute for Ways and Difference, because in my mind, it's really a model for the Emory community, because it embodies what we all strive to achieve, both as an institution of higher education, what we are, but also a great partner in the community, particularly in the Atlanta community and in the Southeast. Many of you may not know that the Institute supports research, teaching, and public dialogue, and that's what we have today, that examines race and human difference. You already heard reference to the faculty, staff, the advanced and postdoctoral fellows that are part of the Institute, and what that means, it's really a place where people create new knowledge on movements, on the civil and human rights that we have, both in the United States and abroad. At the heart of the Institute, it teaches all of us through interdisciplinary methods, and that's something else that's really special about the Institute, is really the interdisciplinary nature, getting people to talk with each other that normally don't talk with each other. Now, you may think that only happens in the broader world. It actually happens at universities a lot as well, where people sort of stay within their disciplines and people that do similar work. And Andra and the folks at the Institute make sure that we go beyond that and really work together. And in doing so, they also push us to ask hard questions, questions about justice. And you would think that by 2018, we would have a lot of answers to those questions. And I think the reality is we end up having more questions than that we have answers. Personally, and that's one of the reasons why I'm excited to welcome you, for me, the strong community partnership that the center has, the contributions that it makes, and all the work that it stimulates across Emory, really gets us to a place where Emory becomes the kind of place that I believe we need to be. We are now in the city of Atlanta officially, but it's not about the physical location, right? It's really about the relationships that we need to build and the mutual trust and respect that we need to have. And let's be real, it hasn't always been the case. So for me, this is a way to show that we actually are doing what we're saying. Emory, in many ways, is an anchor institution, and we will continue to be very focused on being a true partner, not the ivory tower that comes in to say what we're going to do. Today's distinguished lecture will be given, as you already know, by Taylor Branch, who is a public scholar, historian, Pulitzer Prize winning author, and many, many other things. He and I actually had an opportunity to spend a little bit of time together last year when he received an honorary degree from Emory University. So, and sometimes I like to say, you know, he's one of us. He's one of our professors. He belongs to the Emory community. He will place the ideas and the passions of two great thinkers in dialogue for us today, Dr. King and Dr. James Weldon Johnson. And what a fitting way to remember, and I know several people have come back earlier today from Memphis, what a way to remember this, the historical significance of the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination. As Taylor once said, actually recently said, King's work was nothing less than to redeem the soul of America. And I think we need to sort of pause and think about that. So Taylor, we're incredibly honored to have you here, as well as our friends from Ebenezer Church who are co-sponsoring this with us. I look forward to the conversation. So again, thank you for being here, and the stage is yours.
Thank you. It was very exciting to be here last year and to welcome President Sterling that year had just started. I felt the festive nature of that event even when I was here. So it's nice to be back. A little bit breathless, straight from Memphis. I've been there for the last 3 days doing addresses and discussing our film, have to put a plug in for our film, King in the Wilderness. I've been trying for 35 years to get films about the movement on the screen. Alex Haley wrote one of the, not the first script, and some of you probably know how long it's been since Alex Haley died. And I've failed every time. And finally, though, we have a documentary, King in the Wilderness, about Dr. King's last 3 years, which aired on HBO on Monday night. And I hope it does well. It was a great privilege to work on it. But anyway, I was talking about that and also giving one of the lectures at the 50th anniversary celebrations in Memphis. There were many highlights. One of the lowlights, though I have to confess, is that Memphis is on Central Time. So that when I got to my mother's house today, I was still on Central Time, and had to come running in here at the last minute when I realized I hadn't adjusted my watch. So I'm sorry for that, but I'm glad to be here reasonably on time. Among the many highlights of sitting there yesterday with all the friends that I met there, including Pastor Warnock, ran into Raphael Warnock, ran into many of the people, Diane Nash, Bernard Lafayette, who were eyewitnesses in the King film, Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson came to my lecture, which was a little intimidating because I was talking about the last year. But among the highlights that you may not see from the afternoon, which went from 3:30 until the bells tolled at 6:01 Central Time yesterday, a Polish ambassador came from Warsaw to give thanks to the movement for the Solidarity movement that he said dissolved the Soviet Union nonviolently. And he said Poles who did not know how to speak English nevertheless memorized the words to "We Shall Overcome." And the security experts in the West had no idea that anything like this was possible in the era of nuclear Armageddon, that the Soviet Union would dissolve with "We Shall Overcome" not only at the Berlin Wall, but in Prague and other areas there. So that was an unexpectedly broad tribute. They also found, which was really gratifying to me, the widows of Ethel Cole and Robert Walker, who were two sanitation workers who died on February 1st, 1968. They were sanitation workers. On that morning, all of Memphis was, and the news there, not only in Memphis, but across the country, was, would Elvis be able to get across town to the hospital for Priscilla to give birth to Lisa Marie Presley in a Memphis tornado and a gully washer rainstorm that was quite dangerous, and traffic was stopped, and they had police escorts and everything, but they still had trouble getting to the hospital. Unmentioned in the news was that the sanitation trucks that were collecting garbage in Memphis that day had very special rules, which were that the all-black sanitation workers were not allowed to seek shelter in white neighborhoods, no matter how bad the rainstorm was, because the citizens did not want their yards and lawns and neighborhoods to be cluttered. So that in a really, really bad storm, which this was on February 1st, the only place the standard crew was for a driver and 3 tub men. They had tubs, and they would go collect the garbage and then throw it in the back of the truck. Only 1 tub man could fit in the cab, so the only place the other 2 could go in a really bad storm, which this was to get into the back of the unit with the garbage. And on this day, they were in a big old-fashioned cylinder truck that was really old, that had a piston in the back. And when they had to climb in the slits right behind the cab. And when they got in, a broom fell on the lever and compacted both of them with the garbage, such that the only witness saw one leg struggling to get out, and it couldn't happen, and the 2 were compacted and died. The strike started 11 days later, and the slogan, "I am a man," was generated by the striking workers in tribute to the two people who had been compacted with the garbage, because the implicit message was that in Memphis, the garbage workers are garbage, in the sense that they had precious few, no union rights whatsoever, very poor representation, dilapidated equipment, terrible work rules. So that's what the strike was about. It was moving to see that the people who put this event together knew enough about the history of that period and cared enough to find these actually very powerful speakers, the widows 50 years later, who stood there and gave a speech along with this Polish ambassador and a host of others familiar from the movement, James Lawson, on and on. Bernard Lafayette, my friend, who was a teacher here at Emory, and is one of the principal eyewitnesses in the HBO film, was there, but many, many, many others. Now, so those are highlights. My watch was a low light. A medium light, or a confusing one, was that the choir sang "Lift Every Voice and Sing." The whole group, there were thousands, they said 70,000 people outside the Lorraine Motel. I was fortunate enough to be seated, so I didn't have to stand up for 3.5 hours near the front. But of course, when they started "Lift Every Voice and Sing," everybody stood up automatically. When they got to the second verse, the conductor, because the performance was being led by a mass choir from HBCUs, quite a powerful, and they gave a lot of performances through the day. The conductor of that mass choir turned after the first verse and motioned for everyone to sit down. I later realized it's because he had a special arrangement of the second verse that was choral and had all kind of antiphony, going back and forth in complex rhythms, and he wanted people to listen to the choir. But most people did not want to sit down. And so there were some people who were sitting there. I confess, I sat down and got up 2 or 3 times, and there were a lot of other people doing the same thing. Such is the warring respect for this conductor, warring against the respect for James Weldon Johnson and the Negro National Anthem, "Lift Every Voice." So everybody was immensely relieved when he allowed us to stand up for the third verse. But it is remarkable. You have a James Weldon Johnson Institute here. He composed that song, or the poem, and his brother wrote the music, more or less on the back of an envelope for a high school commencement on Lincoln's birthday in 1900, when he was not yet 30 years old. It wasn't a big deal for him at the time, but it has grown to be a big deal for us. And "Lift Every Voice" is what I want to talk to you about, because King and Johnson have 2 distinct voices, but they are profoundly related. So Dr. King was killed 50 years ago yesterday, 53 years ago roughly. He gave the final speech at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March. It's not widely known in the pantheon of Dr. King's oratory. It had a refrain that you sometimes hear, "How long, not long, shall we wait for justice?" And sadly, Ava DuVernay went in the film Selma, because they were so worried about getting sued, they rewrote it and said, soon. They rewrote it, turned it upside down, lost all the music. But that's the anthem for that. But it was over an hour, the speech. One aspect I want to draw your attention to of the speech was that he quoted in full the second verse of "Lift Every Voice and Sing" to introduce his warning in Dr. King's address. And that's the one, that's the tough verse. "Stony the road retrod, bitter the chastening rod felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. We have come over a road that with tears has been watered. We have come treading a path through the blood of the slaughtered. out from the weary past till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. That's a tough verse. And he did it, he recited it to introduce a long-forgotten segment of some of Dr. King's profound oratory that is commonly lost, which was a warning. He said, "This is a great moment. You can feel history here at the end of this march. We're going to win the Voting Rights Act. But I want to tell you, using this anthem as the introduction, that history can go backwards where race is concerned in America, that our discourse can go backward, that our empirical conditions can go backward." And he said that after the Civil War, there are lost struggles to put all three of the civil rights amendments into the Constitution, and then even more lost battles by which they were ignored and put to sleep, even while we venerated the same Constitution that had an embarrassing nullification, as it were, of those three amendments. And he said the South wasn't born with Jim Crow, but that it occurred over time in a history that's largely lost through violence and terrorism that is not widely remembered. Not the Klan stuff, but the stuff long after the Klan. The Klan was more or less dispersed in 1871, and the real violence began after that. And yet today, if you go into many history books and many history departments, the period in the 1870s and 1880s up through 1890, when white supremacy was reestablished, when the amendments were put to sleep, the period is officially classified as redemption. It takes some gall to put a sacred word on a bit of history that is so profoundly ugly that we do not deal with it. And Dr. King was warning that this could happen, and that even in 1965, when we all think that history marches in one direction, that where race relations are involved in America, race relations are so powerful that we can go backwards. And he cited the poem. Now I'm so happy that you have an institute for James Weldon Johnson. What an incredible Renaissance man. And the Renaissance nature of the man and his career, which was on Broadway and in poetry and in the NAACP and a scholar and a writer, is remarkable. But that's part of what was put to sleep when we adopted things like redemption for the name of the period that ended the hope of the end of the Civil War. His career was, when he wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing, he was still a teacher, but he was on his way to New York, where he was writing hit songs, one of which was, some of which were later in Hollywood movies, in Broadway musicals. He knew lots of people. He associated with Harry T. Burleigh, one of the great composers and arrangers of the time. History largely wipes out the fact that Harry Burleigh was an associate and student of Antonin Dvorak, and James Weldon Johnson was writing poetry and knew Paul Laurence Dunbar. History also loses the fact that his side job was an editor for Wilbur and Orville Wright while they were learning to fly airplanes. That there was a period at the end of the Civil War when educated classical black folk associated in considerable respect in American circles. Johnson himself, wrote the campaign song for Theodore Roosevelt in 1904, "You're All Right, Teddy." The words aren't as great as some of the other James Weldon Johnson songs, but he was president of the Negro Republicans Club in New York, got to write this song, and when Teddy got reelected, he appointed him to the Foreign Service. And I'm sure some of you know about his career as a consul in Nicaragua and before that in Venezuela. But history was going backward during that time. When Theodore Roosevelt came back after the Taft years and ran as Bull Moose, he did not allow a single black delegate in the convention, and neither did Taft, from the party of Lincoln. And Woodrow Wilson, of course, was worse than both of them, although it was so confusing at the time. Dr. Du Bois endorsed Wilson. So history was going backward. 1912, the year that James Weldon Johnson finished his diplomatic service for the United States of America, representing us abroad, with history expelling what few black people there were, getting ready for Woodrow Wilson to formally segregate the civil service in Washington. In that period, 1912, is when the NAACP began its annual lynching count, surveying the lynchings. Lynchings had been crescendoing from 1890 up to the beginning of World War I. And it was in the war that James Weldon Johnson began his service to the NAACP as a field organizer. And he organized the first great march against lynching in 1917 down Fifth Avenue, and later became the first black head of the NAACP in 1920 and served from 20 to 30. Those were rough years. They couldn't get a lynching bill passed. History was going backwards. I mean, the Klan would march right down, thousands strong, right down Pennsylvania Avenue. And it's a period of our history that we tend to wipe out, but it was quite respectable to be a Klansperson in that time. I mean, when Birth of a Nation was first screened in 1915, it was screened not only in the White House, but it was screened the next night by all the justices of the Supreme Court. It's a remarkable, and that, to me, the significance of that film, which created Hollywood on the strength of the emotional relief that lifted the white North and the white South in a common bond, that the Civil War that had so divided them could be overcome in enthusiasm for this picture of Reconstruction in 1915. That's what James Weldon Johnson was facing when he was when he came into the NAACP, having had a career as a songwriter and a poet and a diplomat. Now he begins a career as a NAACP executive, and quite frankly, he did a great job, but without very many results, because the direction of history was going against him. One of the things that's so remarkable about that period is that while he was executive director of the NAACP, he kept on his writing work. I mean, and he wrote something that, the first thing that ever just blew me away, this is 30 years ago that he wrote, when I read it 30 years ago, was God's Trombones, a poem about the black preacher and the strength of the pulpit. Its theme basically is that the church is pretty much all black people were allowed in that culture, and that it featured and shined the light on the pastor, who tended to be an outsized personality, and which makes this a good place for me to pause and say we're talking about James Weldon Johnson and Martin Luther King, and I'm here doing it. It's an all-male performance about a movement that was largely led by women until they turned the microphones on, all back in that period, and that was one of the themes yesterday in Memphis, where the president of the National Civil Rights Museum, Terry Freeman, is a woman, and she selected the speakers. Nevertheless, the preacher in those days was a creature of power in the only institution that had to substitute famously in the mass meetings of the civil rights era for every other institution that was absent in trying to mobilize a culture to seek its rights. I mean, it was a newspaper, it was a theater, it was a Congress, it was a debating society, it was a strategy session, it was everything, all rolled into one. Entertainment, it was television, it was everything. And the minister was at the center of it. And I put in Parting the Waters, I found one of the many, the whole book, it's a slim book of poetry about the influence and the culture of the black preacher, and called God's Trombones. And I have a chapter that introduces King into the ministry at the end of his education that I entitled First Trombone. And I put this little excerpt from the poem in there. So indulge me for just a little bit of poetry. I'm not a natural poetry reader. Take him, Lord, this morning. Wash him with hyssop, inside and out. Hang him up and drain him dry of sin. Pin his ear to the wisdom post and make his words sledgehammers of truth, beating on the iron heart of sin. Lord God, this morning, put his eye to the telescope of eternity and let him look upon the paper walls of time. Lord, turpentine his imagination. Put perpetual motion in his arms. Fill him full of the dynamite of thy power. Anoint him all over with the oil of thy salvation, and set his tongue on fire. I thought that kind of introduced King, whose strength was oratory. He studied oratory, he lived it. His father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, all orators. And as reluctant as he was to get into the ministry, because he confessed that most of the ministers he knew, including his father, had elements of blowhard, selfish people. And if you see our documentary, King in the Wilderness, the sections in there on Daddy King are pretty amazing. Nevertheless, Dr. King as a kid said, black culture and white culture are inside out. In white culture, if you're an idealist, you might become a preacher or a creature of the cloth, and if you want to make a lot of money, you're a lawyer. In black culture, if you want to make a lot of money, you become a preacher, and if you have some idealism, you become a lawyer like Thurgood Marshall, because they can't make much money. Nevertheless, he made his peace through theology with a version of religion that he could live with and that he felt could support and did support and set his tongue on fire for the mission he wanted to do. And I think I said this last year, the great distinctive thing about King's oratory was his ability to put one foot in the Scripture and one foot in the Constitution and make them parallel in ways that didn't try to subvert one to the other, which is the great pitfall in mixing secular and religious sources. So that's what he did. And, after the Montgomery bus boycott, he basically tried to preach America out of segregation. Traveled, they claim, 700,000 miles in 1958. I don't think that's true. I had a hard time, but that's what they said. But he certainly traveled everywhere. And his records show that he got supremely frustrated because the audience would cry and stand up every night, not only in the North, but in the South. And he would get tremendous ovations, and he'd wake up the next morning and nothing would change. And he, having been a nonviolent leader in the bus boycott in 1959, he was frustrated enough that he went over to India to study Gandhian nonviolence. Because oratory wasn't getting the job done. He didn't think. He was getting impatient with it. And he came back. I'd probably deny it if I was quoted as saying it this bluntly, but he was pretty disillusioned by the Indian Gandhians. I mean, after all, the premier Gandhian, Nehru, was prime minister, and he was busily building an atomic bomb to deal with Pakistan. And the rest of the Gandhians and the former Gandhians were split into 1,000 different groups, many of which were emphasizing vegetarianism and the protection of insects and various other things. And Dr. King came back and basically told his people, these folks are fairly weird. They were 85% of the population. Anyway, they can't be a model for us, where we're a tiny minority of the population in the United States, and of that tiny minority, only a tiny minority is willing to do anything, and that tiny minority of the tiny minority is at each other's throats about what to do, we have to fashion our own form of nonviolence. And it's not, he said, all the Indians would recommend to us is that we fast. And he said, the Indians they've not eaten our barbecue here. Our people are not going to fast very much. So we have to devise our own form of nonviolence in the United States. And it wasn't very long after that the sit-ins started. And King was the only one of the adult civil rights leaders, even though he wasn't that much older than the college students, being then in his mid-30s, to endorse the sit-ins the next day, instantly, at a time when they were still puzzling most people, or not even regarded as significant, and some people thought of them as like a panty raid, that it was just some mischief. He said, no, this is a breakthrough because there are some parts of human nature that are so stubborn that oratory alone is not enough. That was a wrenching admission for him to make because oratory was his gift and he had studied it. He had studied it in seminary. He had studied it at Boston University. He had inherited, he had grown up with it. The power of the preacher, the first trombone. And it wasn't enough, and he said there are certain times when the power of oratory and words and even belief must be amplified by sacrifice. And these college students have figured out a way of doing that. And it is an immense gift. And so he was for it. Now, he was for it, but he was still kind of a traditional leader. What was unusual about King in this period when he was struggling for exactly the methods that he was going to amplify his oratory with witness that could change America was the breathtaking audacity of the mission he claimed. He didn't say, I want to end segregation. He didn't say, I want to open libraries where, for God's sake, it was illegal for children, black children, to go into libraries, and they would get arrested and hauled out of libraries. He could have focused on that. He said, no, our mission is to redeem the soul of America from the triple evils of bigotry, war, and poverty. Right from the beginning, that's what he said. That's on the SCLC mission statement, to redeem the soul of America, to lift everybody else up toward the real meaning of our own professed values. That's what he said at the Nobel Prize lecture, that mankind's triple scourge of bigotry, racism, war, and poverty were all interrelated. He called it violence of the flesh and violence of the spirit. And that the challenge of the modern age is to figure out how to, in a shrinking world, to realize that in the long run, power grows against the grain of violence, not with it, with the grain of brotherhood, not against it. And that's what he said in the Nobel Prize lecture, which I wish were better known. But his career was traditional in the early phases up to the Nobel Prize lecture, in the sense that he was fairly reluctant about the sacrifice that he was commending in the students. He was still eager to get into the White House, to cultivate an audience with President Eisenhower, with Vice President Nixon, even in Ghana in 1957. With President Kennedy, he lobbied President Kennedy for 2 years, quietly and respectfully, to try to end segregation by executive order the way Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. He wanted Kennedy to write an Emancipation Proclamation against segregation on the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. He drafted it. He took it up there. He He got into the White House. He put it in a very, very fancy gilded leather case, talked to him about the wording, and in the end, what Kennedy did was he said, "You're right, this belongs on the anniversary of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, but to me, it's better to make this a Republican initiative," because Lincoln was a Republican, and instead he read King's excerpts, not formal, because he was worried that it would get out in the news, on Lincoln's birthday in February instead of in January, the anniversary. So he kind of subverted the whole thing. And this was the final disappointment that made Dr. King really resolve to go to Birmingham. You know, we're drifting along too long. I've got to go for broke. We're going to lose our moment in history. That was the first time. But even so, in Freedom Summer the next year, there was an element of reluctance that complemented his natural humility alongside the staggering ambition of what he was calling upon America to do. Until the Nobel Prize, when he's on the international stage, he gives this lecture about nonviolence as an essential tool for the survival of mankind against these three scourges, not only in the United States, but worldwide. He said, by no means excluding the relations between nations. And all of his staff, Clarence Jones, his lawyer, was in Memphis yesterday, and we were talking about in the Nobel, in Oslo, they were all saying they had ended segregation after 10 years after Brown, they had gotten the Civil Rights Bill passed, and that they were looking forward to about 5 years of celebrations and chicken dinners about doing that. And in Oslo, King says, no, we're going to Selma. The mountaintop calls me is nice, but I hear the valley calls us. And he was in jail within 4.5 weeks in Selma behind an aggressive plan to win the right to vote on the streets of Alabama. And it marked a new, and in my view, not a change in philosophy. King's philosophy and his underlying principles and the breadth of that ambition are pretty much constant from the 50s. What changed was how much he was willing to risk and how bold he was in leaving a witness for the breadth of the message that he felt America needed to hear. When he gave that speech that I meant warning about the possibility of going backwards at the end of the Selma March, within a month of that, he was in Boston, testing Boston as the site for a northern movement. He said, we have to use this momentum to show America that race is not now and never has been just a Southern issue. And we're going to find a movement in the North. Not a single member of his staff wanted to do it. Hosea Williams says it's cold up there. There were a whole bunch of people dragging their feet. Diane Nash says in our film, I didn't want him to do it because we had so much work to do yet in the South. But King says nobody else has the opportunity we have. You'd be surprised how many millions of Americans assume that when formal de jure segregation is wiped out, that there is no race problem, because that's what they want to believe. And believing what they want to believe is the lesson of history that he's trying to warn against when he says we can go backwards. So we went to Chicago. In our film, King in the Wilderness, I wrote a lot about the Chicago movement. It's an amazing time. But there's footage in there that I had never seen of Nazi marches. Not out in the suburbs, not out in Cicero. I'm talking about down in Gage Park and Lafayette Park, in the city neighborhoods, the equivalent of Ansley Park here in Chicago, where there would be 10,000 white people screaming and yelling and throwing rocks at him and carrying Nazi signs. And King said we have to do that, even though we know we're going to lose a lot of press support, because the New York Times and the Boston Globe love it when we're marching in Selma, but they don't like it so much when we're marching in Chicago. While he was there, Black Power came out, and he had to divide his time in the Meredith March in Mississippi. And he's marching down the road with Stokely Carmichael. Amazing scenes there, having a debate about violence and nonviolence on the road with, what's that guy's name? The reporter, Frank McGee, NBC reporter. And he's wearing kind of a Raymar of the Jungle, ridiculous outfit as a foreign, like Roland in Doonesbury. And he's got Dr. King on one side and Stokely on the other, and they're marching down. And he says, well, Mr. Carmichael, why do we need Black Power? Stokely says, well, I'm telling black people that they are oppressed because they are black, and the only way they can not be oppressed is to have power, so what's wrong with Black Power? Dr. King, what do you think of? And they went back and forth. And I do want to tell you that some of the, well, these are great scenes. Some of the many, many memorable experiences I had in researching this trilogy were interviews with Stokely because Stokely had a photographic memory, and he was a faithful interviewer. Interview subject. I don't think he had much historical perspective on himself, on what happened, but he was an incredible witness. He said they would argue all night after these things. They would go and he would say, Dr. King, how come America admires nonviolence only in black folks? Otherwise, they like John Wayne and, James Bond and, the Marines landing, and this, that, and the other. And it's not fair that we have to keep inviting suffering and humiliation on ourselves to try to inspire white people to do what they should do in the first place. I've gotten arrested 37 times over 6 years. That's enough, right? And Dr. King, Stokely said Dr. King would say, Stokely, you're right. I'm not telling you that you have to be nonviolent. All I'm trying to get you to see, he said, I could never say that somebody has to endure that. What I am trying to say is that nonviolence is a leadership doctrine, that it is ahead of where white folks are. That if we say that we want to start shooting, not only does it not make any sense militarily, but it doesn't make any sense morally, and we will be stepping back rather than stepping forward to take our place alongside the other trigger-happy, violence-prone people in the United States. So this argument went on, but Stokely won it overwhelmingly in the press and in the culture, to the point that I can tell you today there are veterans of the nonviolence movement in the 1960s who are great heroes who all but deny that they were nonviolent and are embarrassed by it because nonviolence doesn't sound tough. And to me, it's one of the greatest failings of our universities and our culture that we don't think about the relationship between violence and power, violence and nonviolence and power. Dr. King said, if you're a Democrat, if you believe in democracy, you believe in votes, and a vote is the simplest but supreme invention of nonviolence. That's all it is. And every 4 years, the glory of democracy is that we have a festival of nonviolent votes to determine what power is instead of a festival of bloodshed like there is in Syria today. So don't be ashamed of at least being interested in nonviolence. Try to think where it goes. I went to the National War College where there's profound respect for nonviolence. And great surprise to me, all these generals saying that they are interested in nonviolence because they feel put upon by politicians who are trying to militarize problems that are essentially political. And these military historians say, essentially, since Napoleon industrialized warfare in the early 19th century, the trend in history is that military power can destroy more but govern less. And if what you're interested in is governance in an interdependent, highly specialized, shrinking world, nonviolence is what you ought to be studying. And we live in a culture that is now trying to eradicate violence even between spouses and between employers. What is Me Too about? Except the unacceptability of violence, and yet nonviolence as a theoretical construct is not well established, and I commend it to universities to try to do something about that. Anyway, so this is going on between King and Stokely. I was fortunate enough as a graduate student to take a course with Hannah Arendt in the late 1960s, and she came into our course and said, because I told her that Diane Nash, I told her later, Diane Nash resisted nonviolence in her training because she said she was taught in her political science class that violence and power are synonyms, that violence is just the most extreme form of power. That's the impulse, that if violence means something stronger about whatever you're doing. And Hannah Arendt said to our class that that's the established, accepted term in political science, and she said, I think it's wrong. I think a philosopher could prove that violence and power at a certain point are opposites, not synonyms. If all are fighting all, and everybody's trying to slaughter everybody in a perfect violence, meaning everybody's violent against everyone, no one has any power. If no one is violent and you're cooperating, which is largely the picture in the American society today, in our driving down the road, executing our contracts in our daily life, our lives are a festival of votes and not marked by violence. There's a lot of power. So Dr. King was trying to raise up nonviolence against the tide of culture with Stokely. And then, in a cruel, I think that it's a cruel fate of history, he turned that nonviolence against the war in Vietnam against the unanimous advice of his staff, who said, this is wartime. Wars have been good for black people in the past. Whitney Young even said that if there hadn't been a war, black people should have invented it, because that's when traditionally they advanced, by service in the military, and that Vietnam was doing that. And Dr. King opposed his whole staff. He said he had promised James Bevel that he was going to march in a great big march in the UN with Stokely Carmichael in 1967. He said, I promised Bevel. And all of the staff members said, Dr. King, you cannot be serious. Bevel hears ghosts. He's crazy. He's a lunatic. He gets you in more trouble than anybody else. And Dr. King said, yes, but it was his idea to have children march in Birmingham, and it was his idea to march from Selma to Montgomery. And everything Bevel says sounds crazy until I think about it, and I've realized that it's the cracked ones that let the light in. And he's the cracked one, and I see his light, and so I'm going to come out against the war in Vietnam. And the staff did persuade him that rather than march with Stokely Carmichael, because by that time they were chanting ho 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 Chi Minh. The anti-war movement was sectarian and had a lot of super radicals and people who were for the North Vietnamese and waving communist banners. They persuaded him to try to give his message in all of its breadth in a more respectable setting first, and to write out everything so that the America could deal with the substance of his historical analogies, of his defense of nonviolence, of his analysis of French colonialism and how we got sucked into French colonialism, how improbable it was that we really cared about democracy among Vietnamese people when we had so few bonds with Vietnamese people. And he wrote this amazing speech and got into the Riverside Church to give it there, with Rabbi Heschel on one side and Henry Steele Commager on the other side, and John Bennett, the president of Union Seminary, about as respectable as you can be, and distributed his sermon. April 4th, 1967, a year to the day before he was killed. And the next day, in spite of all these efforts to make his position comprehensive, respectable, and even sacred, he was dismissed from one news editorial page to another. The New York Times said that he had crossed the line. The Washington Post said he would never again be listened to with respect. The Chicago Tribune said that his speech was close to treason. Roy Wilkins said he didn't speak for the civil rights movement. His allies abandoned him, his funders abandoned him. Jesse Jackson says in our film that his fraternity brothers and the preachers wouldn't have him in the pulpits, and his fraternity brothers wouldn't have him back to speak even at Alpha Phi Alpha. So this is part of King going into the wilderness, because what he was doing was making witness to the breadth of the philosophy you talked about that his goal was to redeem the soul of America from these triple scourges. And he had done race in large, not just Southern segregation in Chicago, movement to end slums, then the Vietnam War, and then he turned around and completed the witness with his plans for the Poor People's Campaign. It's not very well understood, but the Poor People's there was a plan behind this Poor People's Campaign. It was a plan from a position of weakness. He did not command the headlines in the middle of the Vietnam War. I mean, this is the Tet Offensive. The whole world was all aflame over what to do for and against the war in Vietnam. There had been riots. Dr. King was not front and center. He was still getting denied and having invitations retracted on college campuses. But he decided to have the Poor People's Campaign anyway, and his model was the bonus marchers of 1932, who came to Washington starving. They were World War I veterans, and they had been promised a bonus that they never got. But mostly they were starving, and they came and camped out in Washington. And it didn't work very well. They were driven out by the Army, the U.S. Army. President Hoover sent the Army on them, led by George Patton and Douglas MacArthur, future heroes in World War II, and with cavalry. And several people were killed, and they routed them and drove them out. But it caused a lot of consternation and thought, was this fair? What had happened to these veterans? And out of that churning, 12 years later, in part, came the GI Bill, which Dr. King said is the greatest leap forward in public policy toward lifting people out of poverty. And he says, I don't think we're going to convert America by taking the poor to Washington and saying this is what you should be concentrating on instead of killing people in Vietnam. But maybe someday America will awake and realize that this is a complete witness against bigotry, war, and poverty. Violence of the flesh, violence of the spirit. And then, of course, and all the staff was against that, too. Particularly when he said, not just the black poor, but all the poor. And one of the most, sadly, exactly 3 weeks before he was killed, he had a session at Pact Pascals restaurant with a wide variety of Native American Indian leaders, Puerto Ricans, Chicanos, Latinos of various kinds, Appalachian white leaders, and Miles Horton from the Highlander Center to create something that was all kinds of immigrants, that was cross-cultural. Hosea Williams, again, went nuts against this. I loved him. He said, he froze me to death in Chicago, and now he's taking my budget and giving it to white people. And so he didn't like it, but it didn't get started very well. But finally he mobilized the staff, and then Echo Cole and Robert Walker got crushed with the garbage. Memphis was not part of the Poor People's Campaign. They did not want to go there for preparation, but he said, what better could be an illustration of what we're about than what's there? So he dragged them once more to Memphis. What I'm trying to say is that, to me, there's an upward trajectory of King's career from the bus boycott up to the Nobel Prize, where he's applying the same message largely to segregation in the South. And then there's what I call a driven downward trajectory from the mountaintop of the Nobel Prize down through witness race in the slums, witness against war, the Poor People's Campaign, and Memphis, where he dies among the garbage workers, and tells his staff, basically, There's a quote in Revelation. I hope maybe there's some theological people here, Bible people here. A quote in Revelation, he quotes to them saying, "There's a time when you must finish with what you have left, even if it's next to nothing." About finishing the witness of the Poor People's Campaign, whether or not it was successful at the time. Now, that leads me to my final connection between him and James Weldon Johnson. And that is optimism. Where does his optimism come from? You go through something like that. King was no Pollyanna. He saw more hatred in his lifetime than all of us put together, I think, and kept going out and facing it, out of his comfort zone every day. And I think in his voice, before you hear any words, you can hear a struggle between anguish and optimism. That's what gives it that arresting quality, like a furnace, that you hear in his voice. And yet he always says, I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land. He always has that belief that we can rise upward. And I think he shares that with James Weldon Johnson in a very profound sense, because at the same time in the 1920s, when James Weldon Johnson was heading the NAACP, fighting this undertow in American culture and politics, he was writing not only God's Trombones about the black preacher, but he wrote this compilation of Negro poetry, and to me, the most amazing document, the compilation of Negro Spirituals, which is a tremendous, I don't know if it would have been possible to do it later. Maybe it would have, but it's a tremendous feat of scholarship to have written 2 separate books preserving all these spirituals. Some of which, and he kept writing all this poetry. There was one song that he did with Harry Burleigh. I mentioned him earlier about the prominence of these people, but he kept compiling these songs and writing poetry, even love poetry, that was rich. If I have time, I'm going to read something that he wrote with Harry Burleigh during this period, but it's slightly off point. The point I want to make here is that he paid tribute to the spirituals as a miracle. He thought that they were written by individual people, but deliberately as folk songs. He said they're a whole culture. And at a time when his movement was getting its rear end kicked, to put it kindly, he had absolutely no qualms about saying as calmly as if you and I were in a seminar today that the spirituals that were written in the era of slavery are a miracle, a wonder of hope. He said it would have been a miracle if white people had produced anything like this. But he said, quite frankly, white culture hadn't produced even one thing as nice as even a title of Go Down Moses or Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. And he said this culture rose from the depth of suffering as a tribute to genius that cannot be denied, and I want to make sure that it is here. I think it's slightly related to King's optimism that he had. I don't think King's optimism was all based on religious faith, certainly not in the afterlife. He didn't have a traditional, he had an anguished faith, and it was mixed with a civic faith. And King also, not citing James Weldon Johnson that I can find, but he also cited the optimism of the slaves as a miracle that inspired part of his optimism, even in the suffering of King in the wilderness when he's trying to take on the larger issues against the grain of American history. He would often talk about Jeremiah and how Jeremiah, in utter despair, writes, "Is there no balm in Gilead?" And he said it's a great miracle that the slave songwriter wrote The Spiritual, he said, straightening out the question mark, is there no balm in Gilead, into an exclamation point, and rewriting that verse, there is a balm in Gilead. Where did that come from? That you would take a question that might even the question might seem optimistic to a slave whose children were doomed to slavery. And how would they not only defy the question, but turn it into an exclamation point of hope? And King said, that's a cultural vitality that in the long run won't be denied. So that you see in his toward the end of his life, he's always at war between the depth of our divisions, our commitment to violence, our culture of violence, our bigotry that is much greater than we think it is, and his hope that in the long run we'll be able to deal with that more honestly. I mean, toward the end of his life, he was basically saying, look, the zenith of the civil rights movement that America has since become comfortable with, the I Have a Dream that dispensed with segregation and allowed a lot of us to believe that the race issue is over. Essentially what we did was he say, yes, it went too far. We can't turn dogs and fire hoses on children. We can't bar black children from libraries. We can't basically decree that 80% of the population in the South be maids and sharecroppers. We can't do that, but we drew the line there against anything that affects the shape of our neighborhoods, the distribution of our income, our commitment to war and power. And so we've kind of frozen. And our politics, as he warned, have gone backwards in the sense that the dominant idea, since the movement set in motion all this liberation that has benefited not only black people, but as he predicted, the white South, which was not the Sun Belt when it was segregated, but very soon, shortly after segregation was gone, it did. And all the blessings spread to Southern politicians, no longer imprisoned and stigmatized by segregation, and wealth and affluence flowed to the white South. Dealing with equal citizenship benefited women, all the way down to things beyond the imagination back then, like the Berlin Wall falling, like gays and lesbians not only being not criminal, but civil union being something that's hard to remember was a bold step only 10 years ago. And now here we're past that, and yet our politics are cynical. How do we have such liberation and such cynical politics? I think Dr. King would ascribe that to the influence of race that has made resistance to government and resistance to the politics that have engendered a lot of these changes in the culture the dominant theme in our politics for the last 50 years. And yet, he was hopeful right up to the end. And even from the grave, the last thing Dr. King wrote was published 2 weeks after he died in Look magazine, in which he said, the American people are infected with racism far beyond what they know. That is the problem. But the American people are also infected with democratic ideals. That is the hope. And I think it's every citizen's job to recognize that this was a citizens' movement without great power that restored that hope where there wasn't really very much, and that if they could not be cynical in 1960, facing the conditions that they were in, it's hard for us to explain why we aren't doing our part and can't do more of our parts with all the stirrings of these movements now, to put them together in the philosophy of Dr. King and to do our part to address, to end cynicism, and, as he said, to lift America toward our own professed values. So they are two different voices. There's a cultural voice, an intellectual voice in James Weldon Johnson, an incredibly varied career, in a way kind of backwards, because early in his life he got to enjoy being a consul and doing all of these, and being on Broadway, things that were hard to imagine for later generations of African Americans. And King had this magnificent rise to engender hope, to set in motion liberation far beyond black and white, only to know at the end of his career, when he went into the wilderness, that we were going into another backward phase in our discourse, and it would be to future generations like us to turn the tide again. Thank you.